The Wounded Breed, written by James S. Kelly and narrated by Quippy Quill Production. Prologue, 1900. Christmas was still 10 days away, and retail sales were booming in spite of the early rainstorm. Puddles were everywhere on the streets, yet that had little effect on the shoppers. The gravel streets were full of townspeople. Carriages were everywhere. Children were out of school for 2 weeks, and they were playing in the rain while their mothers were shopping in stores or having their hair fixed. Merchants had huge smiles on their faces while the 2 restaurants and 13 saloons were doing a rush business. To stay in the Yuletide spirit, the town constable was only arresting half of the cowboys who had too much to drink and were shooting at crows flying by. Santa Claus was sitting on the central hotel porch, and a line of children, ranging in ages from 3 to 12, were lined up all around the building. Santa was a big attraction, but so were the warm cookies and lemonade provided by St. Mary's Catholic Church. Across the street in the Santa Ynez General Store, holiday sales were brisk. The assistant manager, a young man of 26 years, was asked to work on his day off to handle the additional workload. He didn't mind. He did exactly the same thing last year at this time. All the other employees were married. There was no one at home waiting for him, no girlfriend, and no one that depended upon him. Over the past 2 years, he'd been able to progress from stock boy to assistant manager, though he didn't see much of an increase in his salary. He accepted this as the way it was for a young man trying to get ahead. Being at the manager's beck and call, though, had its perks. He was able to take time off when he needed, and the few times he was late weren't even mentioned. Everyone at the store thought he was a polite young man who took his job seriously. Little did they know of the dark secret he held within and what mayhem he was planning. Disguising his feelings to all who came into contact with him was necessary. The years of being patient would pay off. His plan was complete, and he was confident of success. Tonight, he would strike. "John, I have to leave early today. Do you mind locking up for me? My wife's not feeling well." The owner/manager was standing in the doorway to his office at the rear of the store. John was making a list of items that needed to be restocked on the shelves of the Santa Ynez General Store. He was concentrating so deeply on his obsession that he nearly jumped when his manager called out to him. He hesitated for a few seconds before responding. "No, sir. I can handle that." "Good. Have a nice evening." "Thank you, sir." At 8 o'clock, John closed out the cash drawer and put the day's receipts in the floor safe in the manager's office. He padlocked the back door, left the lights on in the storage area, and secured the front door on his way out. The owner had an elaborate security system in place, even though they'd never been robbed. The rain had ended, leaving the streets slightly muddy. Standing on the porch of the general store, he saw several patrons leaving the Lucky Lady Saloon and staggering to their horses. He was able to make his way to his small room, a short distance from his place of employment, without encountering anyone he knew. It was sparsely furnished with a bed, small desk, kitchen sink with pump, and a wood-burning stove. He ate some dry bread and cheese he kept in a metal container inside an overhead cabinet, and then washed it down with a glass of water. As he undressed and changed into a black sweater and pants, he mentally reviewed his plan. He covered his face with black ash from the stove and put on black gloves and a black cap. He was fairly certain that he would be camouflaged on this moonless night. Yet he didn't want to take any unnecessary chances. He looked in the mirror attached to the bureau, made sure his clothing was appropriate, and noted that he wasn't nervous. It was too early to make his move, so he decided to take a nap. He had nearly 2 hours to wait. His target was a man of predictable patterns. Every Monday evening, he went to the Grange Hall, played cards until 10, and then walked back to a room at the rear of his barber shop. John wanted to exact his revenge on a more meaningful date, but that would come later. Today would be his first act of retribution. He was excited. Rising about 9:30, he made sure that the lights were out in the widow's bedroom in the house next door. She had a direct view of his only exit, and she seemed to be looking out her window every time he came home or went out. He approached her one day and asked her not to spy on him. When that didn't work, he plastered mud on her windows. She complained to his landlord, who laughed it off. Apparently, the spying wasn't confined to him alone. It was a few minutes to 10 when he turned out all his lights, slipped out his door, crossed over the slightly muddy Saguntaw Street, and made his way into the alley behind the livery stable. His position, and the absence of any light in the alley, gave him cover and a clear view of both the barber shop and the Grange Hall a few doors away. He watched as a young man and woman stopped in the shadows and kissed each other longingly. He heard the young woman protest her partner's advances. Soon they moved on. A few minutes after 10, 4 men came out the front door of the Grange and stopped to talk to each other under one of 12 streetlights installed by the power company in Santa Ynez. John recognized his prey, but not the other 3. He distinctly heard them gossiping about the widow Smith and who was betting her this week. All 4 laughed. Finally, each said good night and walked off in different directions. John went down the alley and quickly made his way behind the barber shop and waited. Soon, he heard someone whistling as they approached his position. The street light cast a shadow of a man. His mark was near. Just as the man turned the key in the lock on the rear door of his barber shop, John moved quickly and came up behind him. The target must have heard someone approaching because he instinctively turned toward the noise. It was too late. John hit him on top of his head with a small lead pipe and then held him up as he started to fall, pushing the limp shape through the door and dragging him to the bed at the far corner of the room was a strain. John checked outside, closed the door, made sure the windows were covered, and lit a match to illuminate the room. He looked around the room. It could easily be his. It was stark and had no feeling. He wondered if the man spent much time in his room. Striking another match, he confirmed that the man was the barber. It wouldn't do any good to attack the wrong man. He placed a gag in his mouth, rolled him onto his stomach, tied his hands behind his back, and lashed his legs together before turning him onto his back again. As the barber began to stir, he realized that he was tied up and strained against the ropes. He was simultaneously scanning the room and trying to free himself. He stopped exerting himself when John approached and stood over him. "Do you recognize me?" The light was dim inside the room, and the barber strained to look at John. Soon, he nodded his head. "Yes, I remember you. You were one of the soldiers that I heard laugh while you were firing indiscriminately at my family. I'll never forget that day. I'm going to kill you, and I'm going to do it slowly, so you'll have time to think about what you and the others did." His voice was shrill, and he knew he had to calm down. What he was about to do would take concentration. There was a look of sheer terror on the barber's face, and he kicked out trying to loosen the ropes that bound him. His was a medium-sized frame, but John could see the muscles in his face contort as he strained to move his hands. Gradually, the barber seemed to give up the effort. John waited until the barber was exhausted and perhaps resigned to his fate. Standing 5 feet 10 inches tall and weighing nearly 175 pounds, he was the same size as the barber. But John's hands were large and strong, and this set the 2 men apart. He put his hands around the barber's throat and slowly squeezed until the man's face turned blue. He released his hold and allowed the color to return. His target couldn't speak because of the gag in his mouth, but his eyes seemed to be pleading. John performed the ritual several times just to torment him. The adrenaline was flowing. The utter hatred he felt for this person was overwhelming. Finally, he decided to put an end to the ritual. When it was over, he felt a sense of relief and one of redemption. He sat back on the bed next to the dead man and tried to regain his composure. He was mentally exhausted. It was past midnight before he removed the ropes and put the garment over the barber's head, slid it over his shoulders and around his body. The hardest part was putting the man's arms into the sleeves. Once the clothing was in place, he propped the body against the headboard of the bed and looked at the costume. It seemed appropriate. When he was ready, John opened the door and looked out to see if anyone was between him and the post office. With no one in sight, he went back inside, pulled the barber's hands toward him, and lifted the body onto his shoulder. It was a short distance to the post office, and though the dead weight of the barber was significant, John easily carried the body and put it on the wood flooring in front of the post office. He leaned the dead man against a structural roof post. The post office sign was mounted on a 6-by-6-inch beam jutting out 3 feet from the building. John fashioned a noose and threw it over the extended beam. He fastened the other end to the hitching post rail directly below the end of the sign. He pulled on the noose to be sure it would hold the barber's weight. When he was satisfied, John placed the noose over the victim's head, lifted the body onto his shoulder, and then slowly let the body hang free. The dead man's feet were touching the ground and his knees were bent. John stuck his head between the man's legs and lifted him higher while pulling on the rope he had double looped around the hitching post. Just as it started to rain, John was able to get out from under the body while holding onto the rope with both hands. Through sheer strength, he was able to tie the rope to the hitching post and keep the dead man's body off the ground. The many hours he spent during the last 5 years lifting heavy bales of hay was paying off. Before he left, he placed a tin cup with a lock of the victim's hair at his feet. As he started to move away, he heard thunder in the distance, and then a bolt of lightning illuminated the area around him. A shiver went down his spine as he looked at the body being lashed by the rain. Lines of the red paint streamed down on the shirt.